Well, hello again. It's Doc Bell back again for segment 3 of Cannabis and Kids, a primer on pot for parents and caregivers. In the previous 2 segments, I outlined the biology, a bit of the history and some of the biology around the cannabis plant itself. And for this segment, I'd like to talk about the impact of cannabis on the human brain, looking at its generalized impact and then looking a little bit at its impact on the teen brain from some of the research that I've been reading in the writing of this book that I've put out. This will take about 25 minutes, and I'll try to be very straightforward and keep it as simple as I can. But basically, it's going to be a little bit of an introduction to neurology and the brain. I'd like to begin with showing you this little character right here. This is a neuron. It is or a brain cell or a nerve cell. And there are 86 billion, if not more, in the human brain. They have this tendency or ability to communicate with one another through these extensions, and there could be any number coming from a given neuron. And where they interact with their fellow neurons, this is called a synapse. So these little arms reach out, and when a stimulus moves along and ends here, there is a release of chemicals called neurotransmitters, and these chemicals trigger a response in the next neuron, and so on. And this can occur instantaneously all through the brain. In fact, as I stand here talking, moving around this pointer, there are neurotransmitters working in my brain that are triggering my speech and my thinking, or lack of thinking, or whatever you want to call it, going on all the time. If you were to get a specialized scan of my brain and tag these neurotransmitters, you'd see this kind of waves of activity moving through the brain constantly. And it occurs whether you're out, out fishing or out running and jogging, performing any kind of activities such as gardening and so on. This activity is going on constantly. It's simply amazing. Now, what I'd like to show you here is even a bigger blow-up of a synapse. It's the same idea. The transmission comes up here, and when there's a stimulus, there is a release of neurotransmitters in these green arrows, and that causes a reaction, in a programmed reaction, I might add, in the neuron, in the postsynaptic neuron. This is pre-synaptic, post, after the synapse. The interesting thing is these neurotransmitters then usually get reabsorbed back into this neuron. So the message comes through, you get a release of chemicals, and it gets reabsorbed. They are sort of the property of that neuron. Now, what I'd like to do is I'm going to switch around and introduce you to Nigel. Once again, high level of tackiness. It's my drawing. I make no apologies, but Nigel is a 37-year-old high crane operator, and he is 37 years old. He has a couple of kids. He's a good bloke. He enjoys going to the casino playing blackjack. You'll see why I bring that up later on. And the odd time he will enjoy a joint. I've outlined his brain here because Nigel's brain is the same as your brain and my brain. If you're watching this from Malmo, Sweden, or Birmingham, England, or Santiago, Chile, we all have this basic structure in this brain. There's really, as far as I'm aware, very, very little difference in the specific areas of the brain and how it operates. So, areas that I want to point out to you that are important with respect to cannabis. The purple area is called prefrontal cortex. Cortex is the gray matter on the outer surface of the brain. Think of it like icing on the cake. It's a layer of nerve cells, of neurons that is extremely important in critical thinking, in forming thoughts and making decisions day to day that are so important in our daily lives. There's a little area here called the hippocampus. Think of hippopotamus, get rid of the potamus, it's just hippocampus. It's an area that has to do with short-term memory. The amygdala, a really very important small area in the brain, but it's part of a bigger system called the limbic system, and it has to do with emotionality fight or flight, awareness of danger, keeping us alert. It's a very important area that is a real fundamental part of the human brain. The fourth area that I'd like to point out here is the cerebellum at the base of the brain, at the back of the brain, where muscle coordination and muscle activity is residing, and that's again a very extremely important area in the brain. The important thing to remember as well is that all these areas are interconnected by neurons, by these long dendrites and axons. So they kind of talk to each other. They can refer to each other. I would use the example, you're walking along the street and you smell a lovely perfume, and it automatically brings back memories. And the olfactory system is connected to emotional centers in the brain, and so feelings, nice feelings can come over you with just smelling something, or vice versa. You know, you can have an adverse feeling as well if the memory triggered is not so pleasant. So the important thing is these regions are operational most of the time, but I want to make an important point here, a critical point with respect to teenagers. This area is the last to develop in our brain, and it is developing up until the age 25 roughly. The amygdala, the hippocampus, the cerebellum, they are up and running by the time you're 15. And of course, if you think about it, it's really very important that this occurs. If you're certainly thousands of years ago, where lifespan was maybe 25 years, you might be having a family when you're 14 or 15. It might be very important that you're a hunter and a gatherer when you're 14 or 15. And having fully operational areas such as the amygdala and the cerebellum would be of a survival benefit. It'd be really important. So for your average 15-year-old person, they have an incompletely operational prefrontal cortex, no fault of their own. It's their future growth and development and learning part. But they have operational amygdalas going on all the time. And the interesting part is that teens therefore tend to react more from input from the amygdala. The New Zealand Pediatric Society website on adolescent brain development uses a very good analogy, or a very good example. A concerned parent is talking to a teen who is going out on a date. Say a young daughter is going out on a date, and the parent is saying, I want you home by 11 o'clock. I really don't want you on the street, and so on and so forth. The teen may interpret that as anger, and the response might be, well, there's no need to get angry. Well, as a parent, you know, you're not angry, you're actually anxious, but by your vocal tone or nonverbal body positioning and so on, in fact, they may interpret what you're saying as being anger. But a lot of that is because a lot of their behavior and mood and so on is dominated, is overruled a bit by the amygdala. The thinking cortex, where an older person might go, I know you're worried, but I've taken precautions, etc., you know, and just basically have a little discussion, and that's it. This isn't all that operational. So it's really important to remember these differences, because they I think, have a role to play in some of the issues around adolescents using cannabis. The final part to this is that this whole system is modulated by an internal, and I don't know how easy it's going to show in this, an endocannabinoid system. And the amazing thing I learned was that we actually have several chemicals that are similar to THC in the brain in modest and very small amounts that interact with certain receptors that happen to be in the cerebellum, in the amygdala, the hippocampus, and the prefrontal cortex. And the role of this system is really very interesting. I'm just about done. I'm going to flip to the other side so I can kind of explain it looking here. So most cells in the body have on the surface of their cell membrane little molecular garages, little locks called receptors that have a variety of function. And I've put a little notch in here as a receptor that would be roughly in here somewhere, and a little red box that's floated down and it's going to interact with this. This little red box has actually come from this postsynaptic neuron. So it's coming back, and when it interacts, the amount of neurotransmission drops down. It's like a dimmer switch, it drops it down. And I'm going to use an example. I'm on my deck and I'm barbecuing, and I've got blues music turned way up. And my neighbor, Alan, is on his deck and he's barbecuing, and the music's quite loud. So what he does is calls me on my cell phone. Tom, can you turn the music down? My cell phone is the receptor, and the message is this little chemical, if you will, and I get the message and I turn down the volume. So in the case of the endocannabinoid system, it works. This receptor comes in, turns down the volume in this. And the net result of this is that the chemicals known as dopamine and serotonin and glutamate are released. This neuron is what we call an inhibitory neuron. And when you reduce the stimulus on it, it releases more of these chemicals. So the bottom line is that the endocannabinoid system modulates, controls as a dimmer switch, the presence of these very important neurochemicals in the brain, such as dopamine and serotonin, as you go through the day. It's operational, and I think it's very important. From what I've read, this system is very important in helping maintain your emotional balance and sense of well-being and so on as you move through the day. So there are 3 or 4 chemicals in this endocannabinoid system, naturally occurring in the brain, and the receptors are called CB1 receptors. They are located in these areas and in a few other areas of the brain, but predominantly science has noted the activity of these receptors in these 4 areas. So the endocannabinoid system has its main impact in these areas. So I've got 2 arrows here. One is a modulation of activity in these areas, balancing things out. But the other amazing thing I came across in reading and reviewing is they also shape and prune the development of neurons in the developing brain. So they have a second role that is really important. And this is something that we really need to think about when we're talking about adolescents using cannabis, because as I said, these areas are still under development. If I go back, I think this is the last time I have to bother you with this. When the brain's developing, the neurons send out arms, branches. They call it arborization, just like in a tree. If there's a neuron here and one here, and this joins in with it, but it's not being used. This pathway here works the best. This is kind of useless. It's a waste of time. This arm, they've shown that these arms will retract back. They get pruned, just like pruning a tree, and they're gone. And that increases the efficiency of learning and the efficiency of activity. And I would argue that this probably occurs when you're younger, say, and you're learning to kick a soccer ball, or in hockey take a slap shot, or in baseball, or a golf swing. As the young person repetitively learns the aspects of whatever they're doing, this kind of pruning is going on to improve the efficiency. And apparently the endocannabinoid system is really critical, or is really important in this pruning. Okay? So, Nigel likes to have an occasional joint. So let's say on a Friday night, and I think I mentioned he likes to play blackjack, because it's just a good example. Say on a Friday night, he has a joint, has some cannabis, and of course the THC comes in, and instead of modulating, like the dimmer switch activity, this works like a light switch. The THC gets in and floods all those receptor sites that I referred to, and the action is like bango all around here. everything kind of shuts down. You get a release of these neurochemicals, and the sensation of euphoria and sensation of being stoned is experienced by the person. That's fair enough, but the thing to remember is that when you're stoned, your cerebellum's affected, short-term memory, the amygdala is affected. So you're chill, things don't bother you. Hey, whatever, dude. You know, I know I'm being sort of, you know, kind of sounds sort of stigmatizing, but this actually is really what goes on. And also the prefrontal cortex, the area of rational thinking, where there's things like delay of gratification, assessment of risk, and so on. All that resides there. So for example, you're walking along the street, there's a lovely pair of sneakers in the shoe store window that were sponsored by a rapper from Los Angeles. They're $700, and you've got $600 in the bank. You'd love to have these sneakers. You'd give anything to have these sneakers. And there's a little voice in your brain saying, get the sneakers because you'll feel good. That, by the way, is dopamine. You'll feel good wearing these new sneakers and so on. But the rational part, delay of gratification, you know better. Your prefrontal cortex, the seat of sober second thought, says, let's wait till next month when you get another paycheck and you can get those shoes. And you often have a little argument with yourself. Well, what if they're not there? They're gone. Well, the rational brain says, well, you know, you can go online and order them. This is the kind of thing that is so important. But this all gets affected with cannabis. And the last thing that Nigel wants to do is go to the casino when he's stoned and play blackjack. Because all these items, the memory, remembering which cards came down, and so on and so forth, they are impaired. And if you're a casino owner, come on in if you're stoned. We'd love to have you. But the fact of the matter is that's really what goes on. Now, the other piece is, I'm going to switch to adolescence now. Remember, I said the amygdala is very dominant in teens. Teens are showing very high levels of anxiety and depression almost globally now, more so than when I was, more so than say 30 or 40 years ago when I wasn't even a teen then, now that I think of it. But the fact of the matter is social media and cell phones are thought to be a huge contributor to anxiety and depression and the struggles that teens are having. And if you think of it, where there's amygdala dominance in the brain, if a teen experiences cannabis, say a 14 or 15-year-old, and the relaxation and the euphoria or the chill, the mellow, might be far more profound than, say, an adult is experiencing. And conceivably, the teen could start self-medicating to treat these symptoms of struggles with anxiety. And we know there are a lot of them, the teens out there that are struggling with this. I would like to refer you, the viewer, to Cannabis and Psychosis - Exploring the Link. It's a Schizophrenia Society of Canada sponsored website. There's a lot of good information, and it is chaired by, or if you will, presented by two people, Elias and Heather, who are cannabis psychosis survivors. And they talk about their journey around this. And Heather talks about their experience as a nerdy, this was Heather's terms, introverted person with some mental health issues who found relief with cannabis. But not only that, found a peer group and felt special and started using cannabis with some regularity. And over time, Heather actually says that they felt it began to direct their life. And Heather looked for using cannabis every day in order to achieve this nirvana or this state of mellow, to the point that suddenly people seemed to be acting strangely, and so on and so forth. Heather had trouble interpreting what they were saying, and really they lapsed into a psychosis with this. So the point here is that I believe, and I think evidence is, that cannabis can be rather compelling to a teen, more so than an adult, for these reasons. And the The outcomes or the risks, of course, can be very serious, one of them being depression. I had occasion to see at least 2 students from our local university when I was working in a walk-in clinic a number of years ago, before I started this journey on looking into cannabis and teens. And the students would be early 20, 21, or 19, I can't recall, but very clearly were struggling with depression. And what hit me was that they were using cannabis every day. They were daily users of marijuana. At that time, I suggested it might be wise to taper off and stop that in terms of assessing response to treatment, which typically is with antidepressant medication. And I will say here a disclaimer, I'm not a pill-pushing person, but I've seen some remarkably good responses to antidepressants when used properly and used in conjunction with counseling and cognitive behavioral therapy and so on. So, but the point is that as a physician, I felt it was really important that the person, I use the term detoxify, and I mean that seriously, get off of any substances that could be disturbing the chemical balance in the brain. What floored me was that independently, they weren't in together, they were at different times. They were unwilling to admit that cannabis could be causing the problem or be part of the problem, and they were not prepared to quit. And I have since learned from colleagues, from psychiatrists whom I know, this is a very common problem, a very common point, you could call it a point of contention, but is this lack of understanding that this substance might actually be causing depression, and it is certainly complicating at that time because of the changes in the chemistry. I'm just about done. I want to mention a couple of other things. One is that the use of cannabis by teens is probably so compelling. Teens have a 50% greater risk of developing addiction than adults do. 1 in 6 teens and 1 out of 9 adults. So of 54 teens, 9 are going to develop addiction if they use regularly. Of 54 adults, 6 will develop. You just have to do the math. And so that's 50% greater risk of developing addiction to that substance. Finally, I'm going to close by talking about tolerance. And this is another very fascinating thing that happens not only with cannabis, but with other substances. With regular use, these receptors, the CB1 receptors, start to close down. So if someone's using cannabis, 3 or 4 times a week, the levels of THC are going to build up in the body. Remember, the half-life of THC in humans is about 36 hours. So a day and a half after using, half of that's still in your system. 3 days after using, a quarter is still in your system. And the body does this kind of funny thing. If with continued exposure, these little guys all around in all the neurons that have these receptors start to become inactive. They close up. I use the analogy of the sea anemone that you find on rocks in the water. If you stimulate a little sea anemone, it just retracts and it closes. These become inactive, so that if you're getting THC, you're not getting the same response, and therefore the person has to smoke or ingest higher levels of THC in order to feel high. But the other very important point is that when it's all normal, under normal circumstances, when you're not smoking or ingesting, there are fewer receptors active in your endocannabinoid system, which is important in ensuring a balance of your emotions and so on. And this is probably why people who are using cannabis, at times, if they are not taking some in, they feel edgy, irritable, in a funk, or maybe depressed, because the activity of this endocannabinoid system is not as prevalent, and therefore they don't get the benefit of even modest amounts of chemical release. So that's really it in a nutshell. So until the next time, please take care.